Okay, welcome to the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey. It's a nighttime episode, so the sound is a little bit low and you'll have to turn it up. And yeah, the video quality's iffy, but a lot of good content here. The Daodejing, you guys. I mean, what was I thinking waiting until episode 86 to bring the Daodejing to the table? I used to teach the Daodejing every semester, and the way I always started was to show the students the following collection, I will splice it in now, of 25 different translations of the first lines, and I would ask them to read through them all the different translations, and talk with one another in small groups, and the goal here was to try to see through the words and get to the idea itself, if such a thing were possible, and then to return to the class-wide discussion and look again at the words, and then try to agree about which translation was best. And by best, I meant which one most accurately conveys the underlying idea. Of course, that's sort of a strange idea. I mean, here's a bunch of students selecting the best translation without reading the original language. But in this case, it's a very apt way of beginning to study this almost unique text. The first verse is actually about this problem of articulation, of what language can and can't achieve. So in my head, and I've read all 25 of those numerous times, and I've thought about this a lot, but the one, I carry my own translation of the beginning of the Daodejing in my head, and the one that comes to my mind is something like, quote, "Any Tao that can be described by language is not the real Tao." In any case, whatever translation you prefer, this is an incredibly profound thing to say. We almost can't think about this verse too much, in my opinion, and I'm going to say more about it below. But before I do, a note on the author, Lao Tzu. He was probably roughly a contemporary of Confucius, which means of Heraclitus also. Lao Tzu itself is just an honorific title meaning old master. And there are a few non-significant suggestions about what his real name might have been. Doesn't matter, really. Modern scholars generally think Lao Tzu wasn't even a real single individual, but is sort of a name for a collective of writers who produced the sayings that constitute the Daodejing. I don't really care either way, whatever. Consequently, you get various, it's so deep in history that whether he was real or not or whatever, the point is you get lots of, you can find in various sources lots of different various suggestions about his life and about the composition of this famous short book. In the one I know best, the story version of his life that I know best, Lao Tzu grows tired of the degeneracy of the society he's living in, and finally, at age 80 or so, heads west to live as a hermit beyond the borders of the empire. But at the exit gates, he is recognized by one of the guards, and they refuse to let him leave until he writes down his wisdom. Now, he tries to resist. They imprison him. Urged again, he says that his wisdom cannot be put into words. Again, they insist. And so finally, he writes it down, and what he writes down is the Daodejing, or at least that's what the story says. Some stories then say that he made it all the way to India and became the instructor of Gautama Buddha. Whatever. The interesting thing here is probably to think about how all of this stuff symbolically or archetypally, and, if you do it that way, it certainly does seem plausible that Buddha or early Buddhism or whatever drew somewhat from this stream of thought. Whether Buddha, discovered it on his own or was instructed formally by a Taoist or whatever. Whatever. But the legends of his life also go on to get very bizarre. And so, for example, one of them says that he stayed in his mother's womb for 62 years and was born with a full white beard and so on. So this is kind of pre history, I suppose. Like, for my purposes, that the part in that legend about the quip that he makes to the guard as he's trying to leave, about how his wisdom cannot be put into words, that's really the key to bringing the Daodejing back to life. It's that first verse, which, again, in another translation might say, Tao called Tao is not Tao. That really implies that everything that follows in the book, and by extension, everything I say here about Tao, will actually not be about the Tao, like, at all. So, I mean, what does that mean? Like, are we, it sort of makes it seem futile, right? Well, Lao Tzu does not listen to Wittgenstein, okay? I mean, Wittgenstein famously ended his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus with that line, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And so maybe it was because he was under duress, or maybe, maybe this is the point of that myth about Lao Tzu being imprisoned and forced to write it down. But for whatever reason, Lao Tzu goes on talking about the Tao right after he says that anything said about the Tao will not be properly about the Tao. So, paradox, right? Lots of thoughts come flooding in here, by the way, on this question of, ineffability. I mean, for example, why was the name of God unspeakable or not to be spoken in the Hebrew tradition? Why was one of William James's 4 marks of a mystical experience ineffability? We might think of Socratic aporia here related to this idea. Among early Christian thinkers, Pseudo-Dionysius stands out for inaugurating the so-called via negativa, or the negative way, or the path of the negative, where the claim was that God can only be defined by what he is not. My favorite version of this line of thought is the Hindu neti neti chant, where one pursues God by this same negative path, pointing to each object that he perceives as he goes through his day and assessing whether it is God. And so neti neti just means not this, not this, not this, not this, right? So it's by this path, this kind of constant rejection of everything that isn't God, that one, it's by this steady rejection of even the slightest hint of what could become idolatry that one approaches God, right? This is not God, this is not God, this is not God, until finally, I guess God is all that's left. And I think Lao Tzu was probably thinking thoughts like these. So just, I guess, keep in mind as we, leave verse 1 behind, and as I try to describe some of what this great book is about and what's great about it, it's an impossible task, literally. No matter what I say with words, I will not be speaking properly of the Tao. When people try to define Tao, sort of in defiance of that first verse, beyond the literal meaning, which is easy. The literal meaning of it is like the path or the way. But beyond that, they will usually say it has something to do with the flow of the universe or something like that. And here I think it's reasonable to suggest a certain sort of kinship with the Western idea of logos. In the West, this idea developed from the time of Heraclitus, which is almost exactly the same period as Lao Tzu's lifetime. And then, of course, the innovative move that happened with Christianity about 500 years later was that we realized that logos was often a very nebulous concept, and so we Christians pinned it to Jesus. We said, he is that, right? He is logos, the literal embodiment of logos or truth. And so, this kind of move never quite happened in the East. There was no embodiment of Tao. And so Tao remains the nebulous concept there that it always was. There is generally the sense that it is a swirling, dynamic flow, often represented by the image of the yin-yang symbol. You've all seen it, as a logo on a backpack or something. Where, the yin, I think, is I can't remember the white, maybe the white side of it is the active, I could be wrong, could be the black. And the yang side is passive, and so on for so many oppositions. Good is one and evil is the other, male is one and female is the other, and so on. Ultimately, it cannot be defined, but it can be experienced. That's the claim anyway. C.S. Lewis said that Tao is essentially equivalent to God, and that God was finally and perfectly expressed in the perfect person of Jesus, right? And so that would be basically it would be the incarnation of Tao in C.S. Lewis's mind as Jesus. And for what it's worth, Chinese translations of the term logos, as we read, for example, in John 1, tend to be rendered as Tao. So in a Chinese New Testament, you would read in the book of John, in the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Tao, and the Tao was with God, and the Tao was God. I hope you think this is interesting. I do. I mean, especially for the way it makes you think about logos, actually. And I suspect that it's interesting because, we have this view sometimes that, people back then. But, come on, at some point, it is interesting that these ideas were bubbling up almost exactly the same time, 8,000 miles apart, halfway around the world. I suspect that ideas traveled along the Silk Road just as much as goods and wares did. Okay, one more thing before I continue and we go further into the Daodejing. I think there is some danger here of severing the teaching from its proper cultural roots. I mean, we'll hear Lao Tzu speak of things like virtue and the way and goodness, but these have meanings and connotations for us that, in the ancient Chinese world, they might not, and vice versa, right? So, the closest familiar parallel here might be the way that some people neglect to notice that Jesus is speaking directly to Jews, mostly. That was his audience, right? And not so much to everyone. And so his message is tailored, to connect specifically with them. If you read the Sermon on the Mount without being at least somewhat aware of the specific assumptions of his Jewish and Pharisaic listeners, then you might hear things in his teaching that he didn't intend. And the same, I think, probably goes for Lao Tzu. If you imagine he's talking directly to you, the 21st century phone scroller, and you don't do any of the historicizing that it takes to understand all this, there is a danger that you might hear it wrongly or incompletely. At the same time, this is also what makes this book so lasting and charming, is that it seems to be nearly universal at times, or timeless. And so it's accessible in a way that is surprising. All right, so there are 81 chapters in the book, and all of them are less than a page long. So I think that makes it shorter than the biblical book of Psalms, for instance. But I think no less profound. It does not seem to be organized according to any narrative or meaningful sequence that I can tell. So you can read these almost in any order, the chapters, and for this reason, it's very difficult to summarize the whole work. I hesitate. This episode is a little bit of a broken effort because it's basically I want to say just go read it. It takes 90 minutes to read the whole thing, and you've wasted half of that time watching this video. But I figure most of my audience has probably read it, or at least read enough of it that they kind of get the idea. Anyway. I'm just going to organize this video according to 3 of his major approaches. His teachings about the self, his teachings about virtue, and his teachings about leadership and politics and government. So, okay, first, let's look at how the Daodejing advises us to manage this thing called self. Like Confucius's Analects, which we just studied, what we are given here is a picture of this sort of hypothetical person called the master, or the true person, sometimes in one of the translations I saw. So the master is akin to Plato's philosopher king here, or to the proficient of Plotinus, or maybe a saint in the Christian tradition. He is the embodiment of goodness and wisdom. But whereas the Confucian master is described as a man who checks all the boxes prescribed by traditional Chinese culture and who fulfills all the rituals and the obligations and so on, by contrast, slightly, I guess, or partially, the master of Lao Tzu's Tao is always affiliated with the image of water. Think about water. about how it moves, about the physics of water. Water goes as low as it can, and then what? And then it becomes totally still, right? If someone opens to it an even lower path, then it goes there. And having found its new station, even lower, again it rests content. Water does not resist. When it encounters an obstacle, it takes the shortest path around it. And it takes on the form of whatever holds it. So in the Daodejing, and by the way, before I go on, I mean, it's interesting because to me, I was thinking about the Logos and Tao, parallel. It's interesting that in Christianity, there are these references to water, but water tends to be the immersion, the baptism, be born again of water and the Spirit. But the Spirit tends to be the more operative, analogy, it seems, in the West. And in Christianity, I'm just thinking about all the terminology here, maybe even about Greek thumos or something. But anyway, the point I was going to make is that the Spirit is, of course, analogized to the wind, right? But think of how similar to water the wind is. They basically have the same sort of physics, right? It's the way that you go around a thing or you yield. It's this kind of go with the flow sort of movement. So anyway, this is what he says in one spot. He says, Lao Tzu says, "The highest good is like water, for water benefits the 10,000 things without striving. It settles in places that people avoid, and so is like the Tao." Or again, with the water imagery, and this time, watch how Lao Tzu combines all three of the themes I mentioned that I'm going to cover here. So self and virtue and leadership here. And again, the idea of picture the Venn diagram with three circles overlapping in the middle there. He says, "Nothing under heaven is softer or more yielding than water. Yet it has no equal for attacking things that are hard and stiff. Nothing can withstand it. Everyone knows that the yielding overcomes the stiff and the soft overcomes the hard, yet no one applies this knowledge. Therefore, an old one said, 'Only a person who has accepted the country's dirt is a leader worthy to offer sacrifice at its shrines of earth and grain. Only a person who takes up the country's burdens deserves to be a leader among those who dwell under heaven. Straightforward words seem crooked.'" So, and yeah, right? I mean, water, the breeze, these are gentle, but also they can be a hurricane and tear everything down, right? Anyway, this is the way of the master, according to Lao Tzu. And I think that what we see here is the inauguration of something that is more like, hold on to your hats here, some of you might not love this, but it's closer to liberal, it's more like romanticism and transcendentalism, and it becomes less like, and I'm doing comparison with Confucianism here, it is less like anything that's kind of orthodox or, sort of high Renaissance-y stuff, although the Renaissance is arguable. But I mean, what do I mean here? In the same way as Buddha kind of outstripped or went beyond or superseded Hinduism, and in the same way that Jesus kind of BTFO'd the, law-observant Pharisaic Judaism that he was sort of born into, I think Lao Tzu here goes beyond Confucianism, or at least that's my impression here. And it means that he probably, this master, this artificial master, he might be like Lao Tzu, kind of a quitter of civilization, one who gives it up, who leaves, who walks away. He probably won't be esteemed by his peers. His social status might even sink if he takes up the way, right? And so, as in Buddhism, the big trick in terms of managing the self is actually to empty it out, become a hollow man, right? So as Lao Tzu says, quote, "Empty everything out, hold fast to your stillness. Even though all things are stirring together, watch for the movement of return. The 10,000 things flourish, and then each returns to the root from which it came. Returning to the root is stillness. Through stillness, each fulfills its destiny. That which has fulfilled its destiny becomes part of the always so. To be aware of the always so is to awaken. That's a great, I don't know what the real root word is there in Chinese, but I love the idea of the always so, the unchanging, the eternal, right? Okay, one more bit on the self, on the theme of self here. Lao Tzu kind of anticipates Matthew 10:22 there, suggesting that like the world is probably not exactly going to reward you. Certainly it's going to misunderstand you and maybe hate you if you follow the way. At one point later he says, "Great straightness looks crooked. Great skill appears clumsy. Great eloquence sounds like stammering." Here's a brief interlude. I had an exchange on Twitter tonight with a guy. I was saying, like, basically, I always in my life very well understood liberal thought until about 2019, and I don't understand it anymore. And it's kind of scary in that sense, because when it gets to a point where like you don't understand it at all, it's like, yikes, what's happening here, right? And I know that it's to a point where the fact that I don't want to cover my face in public or take a shot or whatever, like that is perceived as bad, and I'm their enemy, you know? But like, as I perceive it, I'm just like stuck to the always so. I'm trying to be a rock, you know, like, and so I'm not trying to be mean, but it, you know, great straightness looks crooked. And it seems that the masses are going to perceive certain behaviors that I think of as righteous as being very unrighteous. And it is a kind of scary moment when you realize that the like point of no return split has happened here. There's like a inversion in our hermeneutic or whatever, right? Anyway, okay. In a slightly longer excerpt, Lao Tzu expands on this theme of like non-conformism. He says, "Everyone else is joyous, as if enjoying the greatest feast, or going up the terraces in spring. I alone am drifting without direction, like a baby who has not yet smiled. I alone am moping, as if I had no home. Everyone else has more than they need. I alone seem in want. I have the mind of a fool. How confused I am. Other people are bright and clever. I alone am dark. Other people are alert and self-assured. I alone am dull and muddled. I am unsettled like the waves of the sea, like the restless wind. Everyone else has a purpose. I alone am stubborn and awkward. I am different from other people. Even so, I am nourished by the great." So yeah, again, it's weird, isn't it? Like, remember when, like, just 10 years ago when it was the liberals who were different and weird and stuff, but, like, they have fallen right into March step, and they're all the same, and if you step out of line, like, I don't know, it's very strange, but I alone am stubborn and awkward. It'd be really weird to imagine, like, when everybody's, like, do you see what I'm saying? They don't really get to make that claim anymore, right? It's certainly we who are not getting vaccinated who are the stubborn and awkward at this point. Even so, we are nourished by the great. Okay, so obviously the theme of self eventually coincides with his teachings about virtue. Because, I mean, obviously, because that's the aim of the self, right? And Lao Tzu's teaching here is ultimately very clear, at least in some sense. I mean, he says, for example, in chapter 21, the great virtue is to follow the Tao and only the Tao. Now, of course, it takes some parsimonious to really get a handle on what that means, especially if we're convinced that some sort of via negativa approach is necessary, or, you know, that the Tao is essentially ineffable. But we can definitely put a pin in this very clear thought. Follow Tao and only Tao. That's the surprising and sort of interesting part of that. You know, while I was reading this today, for some reason, it got me to thinking about an old idea that used to bother me. The idea is that the many, many warnings in the Old and New Testaments about avoiding idol worship, they're almost always and universally taught, if they're taught at all, in today's world, like, I mean, even in churches or Sunday school, as being quite simple. And the priest will tell you that, like, in the ancient world, everybody owned a little statue or doll, and they worshipped this doll. And then the priest will tell you, like, so just don't get one of those dolls. Don't worship dolls. And everybody, I mean, in the church, as I'm picturing it in my head, kind of just like looks back and forth at each other and goes like, okay, we can do that, right? Like, yeah, okay, no problem. We won't worship a little wood carved doll. No problem. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Like, to me, this has always seemed deeply misleading. I mean, you've got the 10 Commandments. It's the second one. Don't worship these idols. Like, all the rest of them are really difficult, right? They're not easy. It's like, you're not supposed to ever, like, I don't remember, be an adulterer, covet. These are things that, like, people struggle with. But don't worship a little baby doll. Who cares? Like, that's easy. So it has never seemed psychologically realistic to me to imagine that ancient peoples could fall so totally into worshiping little wooden statues. The guy I was talking to on Twitter about this, he was like, oh, you got to change your mindset. It's not about consumerism or whatever. It's about animism. And I mean, maybe he's picturing, but again, he's picturing people who aren't like us at all, right? These are, I don't know, like some kind of primitive they aren't like us. And maybe it's we who aren't like them, whatever. But like, they think that things are infused with spirit, and so this could happen to them. But it's like, well, okay, but that's just odd to me that it wouldn't be a temptation for us at all. It's just like the easiest commandment ever. It's not like, why would this be such a concern for God unless it was tempting to people? So it's like I said, too easy to, I don't know. Okay, God, it doesn't seem to me like God would make it the second commandment is what I'm trying to say. Okay, basically I'm saying that these dolls, if that's what they were, must have been much more engaging than we're inclined to think. Like somehow, and I'm not sure how, but they must have been almost iPhone level engaging. Or maybe they came in, I don't know, different variations like brand name shoes do, and people got into a competition about them. Or maybe you can think of other explanations. I don't know. But the point is, don't imagine that these ancient peoples were any different than you are. You have to imagine a dangerously attractive thing that possesses your consciousness so wholly and that even manages to get you to worship it instead of God. Okay, so now when you hear Lao Tzu say, follow the Tao and only the Tao, hopefully you understand how difficult the second part of that line is. So it means like, do not fall into idolatry. And do not follow the college curriculum. Do not follow your doctor's orders. Do not listen to CNN's narrative. Do not listen to me. Follow the Tao. Be like water, right? One of the things I enjoy about Lao Tzu's teaching is how often he uses simple images and analogies to make abstract moral points. Very much, I think, comparable to Jesus' parables. So, for example, in speaking of virtue, he says, the person on tiptoe is not steady. The person with legs astride cannot walk. Those who look only at themselves see little. Those who justify themselves are not distinguished. Those who brag have no merit. The work of prideful people will not endure. From the standpoint of the Tao, these things are excessive food and tumors on the body. As they bring sickness, followers of the Tao do not linger around them. I know that some people don't like to think like this, and so they won't enjoy this as much as I do. Some people prefer to hear Immanuel Kant talk about moral imperatives or whatever in very abstract, very technical terminology. But for me, anchor your moral teaching in natural images, and I get it, like right away. A little more on the idea of virtue now. Lao Tzu really nails it in section 38. And I gotta say, as you listen to this, try to hear with like virgin ears that he places following the way even above doing the rituals. He sort of one-ups Confucius here, as I was saying above. And to my ear, at least, he becomes a parallel to Jesus in relation to those Judaic legalist Pharisees that Jesus himself like one-upped or outstripped or, whatever. So, quote, a person of high virtue is not conscious of virtue and therefore possesses virtue. A person of little virtue tries to be virtuous and therefore lacks virtue. A person of high virtue does not make a fuss and is not seen. A person of little virtue always makes a fuss and is always seen. A truly good person functions without ulterior motive. A moralist acts out of private desires. A ritualist acts and, when no one responds, rolls up a sleeve and marches. When we lose the Tao, we turn to virtue. When we lose virtue, we turn to kindness. When we lose kindness, we turn to morality. When we lose morality, we turn to ritual. Ritual is the mere husk of good faith and loyalty and the beginning of disorder. Knowledge of what is to come may be a flower of the Tao, but it is the beginning of folly. Hence, the well-formed person relies on what is solid and not on what is flimsy, on the fruit and not the flower. Therefore, such a person lets go of that without and is content with this within. Did you hear that? I mean, ritual is the mere husk of good faith. That's awesome to me. A Protestant. Now, of course, to get to our third circle of this Venn diagram, where we have already glanced at the teachings of self and the teachings on virtue, let's look now for a second at Lao Tzu's teachings on leadership and government, and understand that this very much overlaps with the first two themes. Basically, as in Plato, the country can only be effectively governed by a man of virtue. So, for instance, Lao Tzu says, "For governing others and serving heaven, there is nothing better than moderation. A person who is moderate returns to the path. Returning to the path brings an abundance of virtue. This good store of virtue cannot be conquered. Virtue that cannot be conquered knows no limit. Only a person who has limitless virtue is fit to lead. Only the leader who possesses the mother of the country will long endure. This is called making the roots go deep by restraining the trunk. Learn to focus your life, and you will see many days." This reference to the mother of the country indicates the Tao. It's one of the titles. So only the leader who possesses or follows the Tao will long endure. Well, what does that look like in terms of practical governance? I mean, people often see what they want to in this stuff, but to me, Lao Tzu often sounds like a kind of like an aristocratic libertarian. He says things like, "When the government is unseen, the people are simple and happy. When the government is lively, the people are cunning and discontented." Now, maybe that's not exactly libertarianism, but it implies a light touch, not the kind of heavy-handed New World Order, comply or face the consequences stuff that we've been getting lately. Here's another section that seems similar. He says, "Govern the country by being straightforward. Wage war by being crafty. Win all under heaven by not meddling. How do I know that this is so? By what is within me. The more restrictions there are, the poorer are the people." You know, as I read these, it occurs to me that I hardly need to offer any deep analysis because it's all so clear. It's so straightforward, so direct, right? But you know, the trick is nobody ever seems to be able to abide by this stuff. So how do we take it from fortune cookie sounding truisms to actual life steering material? That's not an easy thing, especially because a lot of what Lao Tzu says requires not effort, but the letting go of effort. And we're proud of our effort, you know, but you got to give up your preferences and desires. Stop swimming against the stream. It was Taoism, after all, that was the basis of the principle of yielding that is one of the keys to Taekwondo, I think, or whatever, one of those martial arts, where you use your opponent's momentum against him by yielding. You make him fall. So think of the lineman in football who, like, once in a while backs away at the start of the play, and so the guy facing him just sort of, you know, falls on his face, right? Anyway, on that problem of making the teachings actually improve your behaviors, Lao Tzu is aware of this problem, and he tries to meet us where we are. He knows that most people will hear but not understand. Again, parallel to Jesus' preaching here. So he says, "My words are easy to understand and easy to put into practice, yet no one under heaven understands them or puts them into practice. My words have an ancestor. My actions are governed. Because people do not understand this, they do not understand me." Well, what does he mean here? His words have an ancestor. The idea seems to be that the language, the words, all these teachings are sort of a second order thing. So to really understand him, you have to see through the words to the idea itself, as I was suggesting at the start of the video. Get through the obstructions that are always attending the use of language and understand, right? The Daodejing is definitely one of the must-read texts for anyone who seeks wisdom. I absolutely recommend it, and I recommend reading it more than once in a physical copy. You should own this book. It certainly is the basis of a religion, but for those of us who aren't formal Taoists, I think it's almost an advantage. We get to read it cold, which means we will be, at least in some ways, better able to perceive some of its arguments. A prophet is never recognized in his hometown. We're not his hometown. And so, in a way, we might be better able to perceive some of the wisdom that we're getting here. I know it seems like we're in a phase of history where we've got the rainbow flag energy coming at us and what seems like matriarchy, or at least rule by hyper-domesticated necktie-wearing bald-head bugmen. And so maybe some Bronze Age pervert muscle man energy is necessary to be the opposition force here and now, to remedy things. I understand the appeal. But Lao Tzu most often recommends the passive way, the gentle path. So, in a second here, I'm going to conclude by reading some of his best words from section 76, and then I'll just not comment. I'll be like water and just leave it. But I did want to say before I read this that, I guess if we contrast him to Confucius again, for Confucius, a certain amount of order and the bureaucracy was established by Confucianism. Lao Tzu does seem to be the undoing of that, and I wish that passivity didn't right away have this kind of negative connotation of feminineness to it. As he says, and I think he's right, that ultimately woman conquers man, right? That's why you guys are always looking at that stupid renal failure account on Twitter. We get conquered by woman, and it's because woman is the principle of passivity or something. And so if you realize that you can channel that energy mentally, strategically, it's not gay or feminine to do that. It's strategically advantageous in the same sense that it could be helpful in the martial arts or in football or something else. Anyway, so he says, "At birth you are supple and soft. At death you are stiff and hard. Grass and trees are pliant and tender when living, but they are dry and brittle when dead. Therefore, the stiff and hard are attendants of death. The supple and soft are attendants of life. Thus, the hard weapon will be broken. The mighty tree will invite the axe. Therefore, the hard and mighty belong below. The yielding and gentle belong above." Thank you for listening. Be supple and soft, gentlemen. See you next time on the Godward Podcast. Bye-bye.